Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll explore the vital role played by cavalry in the early part of the Great War. We'll look at its purpose, training, employment, and performance on the battlefield, and discuss whether it was at the time an obsolete weapon of war or an integral part of the British Army's order of battle. Well, hi Dan, we've discussed a great deal over the course of this podcast series, but I have to say we've generally focused on machines when we've been talking about weapons of war. We talk about artillery, tanks, aircraft, zeppelins even, but there's been a little bit of an elephant in the room, or perhaps a horse in the stable, and that's the role, which was a big one as we'll see in the First World War, of horse-mounted soldiers. So it's a pleasure to be joining you today to discuss the much maligned and, dare I say, much misunderstood cavalry.
Yeah, hi Spence. It is. I think it's somewhat, to some extent, a missing link, actually, because as you say, we've covered all of these branches of war, all of these emerging branches in particular, and really we haven't looked at one of the most well-established and most clearly considered ones in 1914. If you were to ask any British soldier, or even a British member of the public, or someone from any country for that matter, in 1914, describe the arms of the military, cavalry is certainly going to be mentioned, and be mentioned in a very straight-faced way as well, as a serious, important, and integral part of any army's order of battle. And so I'm looking forward to it. I think probably we're going to run into multiple episodes here. It could be quite an exciting opportunity to really delve into the story of cavalry. But I think what we should go into, perhaps at least as early as 1914 is concerned, is with a genuine belief, and I think a fair one, that the cavalry had well and truly earned its place in military circles. And by 1914, everybody else thought so.
Cavalry had been around as a major arm on European battlefields for centuries by this point. In fact, academic historians have speculated that a key cause of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 300s and the 400s was that the Roman army was just incapable of dealing with masses of cavalry coming in the form of Goths, Huns, Visigoths, and Vandals. And since that time, although the fortunes of cavalry had ebbed and flowed a little bit with as technology changed, cavalry had always been seen on European battlefields. And as the armies of Europe moved through the medieval period, through the Renaissance, and into the Age of Reason and beyond, cavalry was an integral part of every army, and it grew in its organization, it grew in its role. In many cases, it grew in number. In fact, the largest cavalry force ever deployed up until the First World War was Napoleon's Grand Army in 1812 when it invades Russia. It's estimated it takes about 80,000 horsemen of various types with it into the invasion of Russia. Staggering proportion. Almost 1 in 4 of Napoleon's army that invades Russia is horse-mounted. So a huge number of horsemen. And it's really from the image of cavalry in the Napoleonic Wars, and indeed much of their organization in the Napoleonic Wars, that actually leads to how cavalry is formed on the eve of the First World War, a century later. And it's worth delving into a little bit here, Dan, about different types of cavalry, because I know our audience is highly educated on many aspects of the First World War, but a lot of people, when you're exposed to all the different names of types of cavalry, it can all be a bit bewildering. But Dan, I'm going to give away your secret here. I know you're fascinated with the Napoleonic Wars, possibly even more so than the First World War. And so many of these names, so many of these regiments come from the Napoleonic period. So I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about the different types of cavalry that actually exist, because it's true of pretty much all European armies with one or two exceptions. So to start with, Dan, tell us what's the difference between a hussar and a dragoon, or is there one?
Well, it's putting me on the spot here a little bit, Spence, but I'll do my very best with it. I think in terms of cavalry, of course, at its very base, what we're talking about is a man mounted on a horse, at least to start with. Actually, you could take that away almost straight away, because a dragoon is very different to a hussar in the way that they fight. Not the way they travel, but the way they fight. Specifically, dragoons are mounted infantry. This is the role that they're going to employ. So they're a traditional soldier that rides into battle, dismounts, and fights, typically out of horseback. So if you like, and we'll certainly come back to this concept. In fact, there's a good argument that many forms of cavalry in the First World War are going to take on this dragoon method of fighting. Actually, it's very successful, as we'll see, in both 1914 and 1918. A hussar is typically going to be a light cavalryman. He's going to be mounted and armed, traditionally at least, with a saber, with a cutting blade, and they're going to be used in a light cavalry role. They're going to be used in screening. They're also going to be used in things like reconnaissance fairly heavily. They're not necessarily the big heavy arm of cavalry that we consider. That would be more the cuirassiers, who are going to be the real heavy cavalry. These are the guys that, if you go back to the Napoleonic Wars, you see charging with breastplates, smashing into the enemy, nearly a ton of man and horse, really hammering through infantry lines and into infantry squares. This is the kind of traditional role of the cuirassier. The lancer, on the other hand, another lightly armed, fairly mobile, usually on smaller horses, form of cavalry. They're going to be your blitz attackers. Their job, quite literally, is to be lance armed, so a staff with a point on the end, and to really get stuck into the enemy at short distance. Quite often against a retreating enemy as well, can be very effective, those lances. Whereas cuirassiers, lancers, dragoons, and hussars have all got the same, if you like, the parentage, the same lineage, in that it's a man on a horse. They've got very different roles, as you say, Spence. The key one, I think, for today, though, is going to be the dragoon. It's the idea of riding into battle, into a certain location, dismounting, and then fighting from there. And I wonder, Spence, I wonder if we lay this out right at the start. And this is a concept that I know you've mentioned on previous podcast episodes, and I don't want to jump the gun too much here, but we possibly need to consider cavalry really as almost a short-range special force in the First World War. People who can ride in at high speed. This is the whole reason cavalry exists on the battlefield. They can maneuver quickly. They can go from place to place very quickly, move into a place, dismount, hold it, engage, and they can act as a kind of shock force in a sense.
They can. And I'm glad you brought this up, Dan, because this speaks to a debate that was going on in the cavalry, especially in the British cavalry, but also to a lesser extent in the French, German, and Russian, and indeed Austro-Hungarian cavalry, about what do you actually want your cavalry to do. And really, on the decades that followed the Napoleonic Wars, instances of cavalry really being successful in a mass assault role were pretty hard to come by. British listeners will be instantly familiar with the charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War in 1854. Relatively small scale, but effectively a disaster, a do-or-die charge down a valley into the teeth of Russian firepower. Charges occurred in the Franco-Prussian War, particularly German cavalry charges, which were complete disasters, didn't get anywhere, were blown away by incoming fire. Cavalry charged at times, not much cavalry involved in this war, it has to be said, but cavalry charged at times in the Russia-Japanese War with very, very limited effect. And there was a debate going on in European armies about, well, what is the future of cavalry? Obviously, there's more and more firepower coming onto the battlefield. Cavalry are a big target. They can be hit more easily by bullets and by artillery shells and so forth. And also the battlefields of Western Europe are getting more crowded. They're getting more built up. There's not the same level of open field that you'd have found in Napoleon's time, for example. So there was a big debate about, do you want to go for mass cavalry? And we're talking thousands of cavalrymen charging at once. Or do you want to try and fight with smaller groups of cavalry? And this debate was by no means settled on the eve of the First World War, but we can detect certain directions of travel. So the French and the Germans generally leaned much more towards the mass cavalry approach, and we'll come on to the sheer numbers of cavalry around in 1914 in a moment. But the British Army, a lot smaller, and reliant a lot more on very high levels of professionalism, very high levels of training, rather than sheer mass. I think the British cavalry started to take a slightly different approach and started to see itself as you say, Dan, these very short-ranged special forces that were going to be out in front of the army. They were possibly going to be screening the army. They might even be undertaking raids behind enemy lines. And the concept of a cavalry raid was very, very current in the years before the First World War. Trying to get a group of cavalry behind the Germans, chew up railway lines, blow up supply depots, and race away before they could be caught. No such raid actually occurred on the Western Front, but perhaps in future episodes we can get into some raids that did occur on other fronts. So the idea that cavalry were a sort of very short-range special forces is by no means far-fetched. You can also see them as a very short-range sort of paratrooper force that can go forward, take an objective, hold it for a time, dismounted or mounted for that matter, until the rest of the army catches up. But the important point to really get across is nobody was entirely sure if that was the right way for cavalry to fight. And even though that was the general direction of travel for the British Army, emphasizing smaller cavalry formations that could fight dismounted or fight mounted, there was also a concern in Britain that, well, that's all well and good, but what happens when you're facing a German cavalry corps with something like 15,000 horsemen coming at you? You're not going to fight in a small skirmish line then. And so there was tension in the British Army about how best to do this, how best to form your cavalry, how best to fight them. But the British had a big advantage, and this was that the cavalry had gone through a really bruising experience in the Boer War between 1899 and 1902. The British cavalry had not done well in this war. They had not had a happy war. They'd had all kinds of problems. They'd expended, in the euphemistic term of the British military, they'd expended nearly 350,000 horses. Just worn them out, had them killed in battle, died of disease. Staggering rate of horse attrition. And on the battlefield, they hadn't achieved very much. They'd managed to charge the Boers once at the Battle of Elandsgate in October 1899. And there'd also been a cavalry breakthrough at a place called Klip Drift in early 1900. But otherwise, they hadn't really done much. And they were mainly known for really patrolling around the empty wilderness of South Africa, exhausting horses and periodically getting ambushed by the Boer guerrillas. So it was not a happy war for them. And in the aftermath of that, there was a huge reform of cavalry that really emphasized, look, cavalry is useless if it exhausts its horses. There was a huge new emphasis on what's called horse mastery, just how you care for a horse, how you feed it, how you water it, how you groom it. Simple things like take the saddle off when you're still. There's no need for this horse to wear the saddle if you're not in contact with the enemy. Dismount from the horse and walk alongside it if you don't need to go fast. Make sure your horse is properly fed, watered, cared for. And this became a real cornerstone of British training, along with these tactics we've been talking about, fighting dismounted as well as being able to charge on horseback. And really what we start to see in the pre-First World War period in the British Army, known for its training, of course, is the cavalry in some ways are an elite of an elite army. And we have this image, I think, Dan, of cavalry. We've drawn it from comedies like Blackadder and Oh, What a Lovely War, maybe even the Flashman novels, if we're going back further. Cavalry as these foppish idiots with big twirly moustaches who don't really know anything and are just going to go headlong and charge anything without giving it a moment's thought. But actually, I think that's a misleading approach, because British cavalry, it's pretty different to European cavalry in this respect.
Yeah, very much so. And I think you can even go back earlier than that in terms of this kind of preconceived idea that we've got about the role of cavalry. The Duke of Wellington, famously during the Napoleonic Wars and the Peninsular Campaign, was not a fan of his cavalry. He said the British cavalry is the best trained in the world and the worst led. He had a real mistrust of cavalry, particularly overcharging and overstretching its limits, famously done a couple of times at Waterloo and in various other locations. That being said, the role, I think, maybe there's a misnomer here, Spence, in terms of the actual role that cavalry is designed to take. And I can understand, and we should maybe set this out from the outset, when we talk about cavalry and we throw it into what we're covering here on this podcast, which is this general idea of static warfare and trenches, barbed wire machine guns. You think, who on earth would include cavalry in that scenario? Of course, at the start of the war, none of those things exist. And actually, the role for which cavalry is designed is absolutely fitting. It's designed to screen enemy positions. It's designed to screen your own force going forwards. It's designed, as we say, that kind of short-range paratrooper role. It's also designed to literally gather intelligence. And this is a role at which it's admirably suited. It can get in and out of positions quickly. It can move around the battlefield. It can report back quickly. So it's got all of those kind of natural advantages. And again, coming back to this idea, and we wonder if perhaps you know the origin of it or whether there's any truth behind it. But one of the famous things is the sticks that's used to beat the cavalry actually comes, and often a stick to beat generals, we should add as well, is this British senior officer's idea on the outbreak of war when comparing with something like aircraft, and saying an aircraft will never replace a cavalryman, a man on horseback in terms of its influence on the battlefield. And this is specifically aimed at the idea of aircraft being able to gather intelligence and perform reconnaissance sorties and this kind of thing. Well, yes, that's absolutely true, but they don't have the same job in 1914. An aircraft can't go and land on an objective and continue to hold it. It can't shoot at the enemy in any meaningful way. It can't hold up enemy advances in the same way. Yes, reconnaissance, of course, is going to be far better by aircraft. But by the same token, aircraft can't and shouldn't do some of the things that cavalry can.
I think that's a really great point, and it reminds us of something that I think perhaps in the 21st century we're apt to forget. And that's that to the armies of 1914, be they British, German, or French, reconnaissance was actually a twofold duty. Reconnaissance to find out about the enemy, yes, aircraft can certainly do that, but also what was called in the British Army protective reconnaissance. We might term it screening now, so stopping the enemy reconnoitering you. Now, in 1914, only cavalry could do that. Air-to-air combat doesn't exist in 1914. Technology doesn't allow for it. So aircraft can scout, but they can't really prevent the enemy scouting back. You made some great points as well, Dan. Aircraft can't land and hold an objective. An aircraft can't swoop down and take a prisoner that might be useful for interrogation or capture some unit insignia or anything like that. In 1914, aircraft are extremely useful, but they're also a very, very new technology which has some notable military limitations. Cavalry is not new. It's been around for centuries, thousands of years, in fact. And it can do these things. It can take objectives, it can reconnoiter, and it can screen and protect as well. And it can also, in theory at least, transition if an opportunity arrives to launch an all-out attack against the enemy and perhaps sweep them away with a cavalry charge or gun them down actually with a lot of firepower instead. So cavalry is a very useful multi-purpose unit. And there's another element as well which might seem obvious, listeners, but is worth remembering, and that's that there isn't really a motorized branch to any of the armies in 1914. Armies use trucks. There's some very limited use of armoured cars, particularly later in 1914. But generally, the only really mobile, beyond just foot marching speed, aspect of any army is going to be its cavalry. And although in trench warfare that might not seem so important, in 1914, where you have a German invasion and very rapid movement, troops redeploying quickly, Germans advancing very fast, having cavalry that can really go deep, can go at least twice the speed of infantry, perhaps even more, over a period of time, and still fight at the end of it, is incredibly useful. And it's easy, and there were critics, in fact, in 1914, who argued that the day of cavalry was passing. It's easy to say that. It's not so easy to say, okay, great, you've abolished cavalry. No cavalry now. What do you replace it with in 1914? Well, there isn't anything. And add to that, let's say the British and the French go to war in 1914 and they've abolished their cavalry and the Germans retain theirs. The Germans are going to have a huge advantage in terms of mobility, this ability to advance and this ability to fight and indeed get behind the enemy, get into their flanks and so on. And that's something I think that's really easy to forget. Cavalry in 1914 was genuinely useful. And within this context, the British cavalry, small in number as it was, perhaps about 9,000 men of the BEF were cavalrymen, total fighting strength in the form of a cavalry division and an independent cavalry brigade. But they were very well-trained men. There was a mindset, I think, to the British cavalry that was really quite special. These were highly trained soldiers. Notably as well, Dan, that they're well-armed. Unlike European cavalry, British cavalry carries the Lee-Enfield rifle, the short magazine Lee-Enfield, and they're trained on exactly the same level of marksmanship as the infantry. So they carry out the mad minute exercise of firing 15 shots in 60 seconds at a target 300 yards distant. And the British cavalry division is actually pretty well equipped with machine guns and light artillery as well, 13-pounder guns. In fact, proportionately, the cavalry division has more firepower than an infantry division proportionate to its number of actual fighting men. And when you combine that with this expertise in horse mastery, keep their horses fit and fresh, and their ability in reconnaissance, whether that's going forward or fighting defensively, you've actually got a pretty useful, powerful fighting arm alongside you.
Yeah, I think there's some really valid points you've made there, and particularly, doing away with this idea that cavalry is just a bloke in a very brightly coloured tunic with a sword, kind of wandering around a First World War battlefield completely out of place. Of course, it's not the case at all. I'm going to suggest a phrase here that the cavalry is the Swiss Army knife of the British Army in 1914, can do a little bit of everything. But importantly, you could also argue, albeit an unmotorized version, it could also be seen as a very flexible high-speed battle group, because you can bring up guns, you can bring up machine guns, and you've got a genuine amount of firepower. And I think part of that can be seen in the Lee Enfield rifle itself, which is really interesting because the number 3, the SMLE, is going to be specifically created so that it can be withdrawn from a cavalry holster. It can actually be used by the cavalry. So this is a specific focus as opposed to the long Lee, which was slightly too long for a man mounted on horseback to withdraw it from a cavalry holster. So it gives us an idea, actually, that this is very much an integral part of the British Army at the time. And there are lots of possibilities. In fact, I think that the most powerful thing you said there, Spence, in terms of understanding the importance of cavalry is not what did it do, is imagine what would have happened if we didn't have it. I think that was a really clever way of looking at it. And I agree entirely. If you strip away the cavalry, albeit a limited number, from the British Army in 1914, it's effectively blind. There's a very high chance it gets destroyed at some point during that first month or two of warfare because it just doesn't have any flexibility around it. These antennae that stick out and will feel out for the German positions and will spring traps ahead of time and will clear the path ahead of the route of advance or retreat, both of which happen within a short period of time. So absolutely essential in its early role.
It is. And just to add a little bit more to this point, the British cavalry is different to European cavalry. We've really got to emphasize this point. It's smaller in number, significantly smaller, fewer British cavalry than there are French and German cavalry. But as you say, it has an infantry rifle. In fact, the short Lee Enfield has been designed specifically so it can be used by infantry and cavalry alike, trained to a very high standard. And in the pre-war army, there's a little bit of criticism of what's called the cavalry mindset, and it can sometimes give rise to this almost stereotypical idea of cavalry as hard chargers. They're going to put their heads down and go. And the social exclusivity of cavalry officers as well play a role in this. To be in a cavalry regiment in the pre-war army, you need a little bit of money behind you because the mess bills for the cavalry are notoriously high. There's also a slightly lower educational requirement, especially in the 1890s, to actually enter the cavalry as opposed to the infantry or the artillery and the engineers. But that doesn't mean in the pre-war army that these are all idiots who are reckless. In fact, to actually rise up the ranks of being a cavalry officer, you need to have something about you. And that might not be book learning. There's certainly an element in the cavalry who reject a little bit of bookish education on the grounds that the only way you can be a good cavalry officer is to spend as much time in the saddle as possible. And for this reason, nearly all cavalry regiments in the British Army maintain very active polo teams, horse racing teams, and fox hunting groups as well, because this is going to give you some experience of handling a horse at high speed in potentially difficult conditions, difficult terrain. Sometimes the army's criticised, or the cavalry's criticised for its emphasis on fox hunting, but that's actually a useful form of fun training. You can ride through countryside. It will give you an eye for the countryside later, gallop around, look around, give you an idea about how to maneuver your horse and so on. And all this contributes to the so-called cavalry mindset. And so the British Army is really looking for cavalry officers who are willing to take risks and charge home. A phrase that's sometimes used at the time is "you must ride or you must die," a very dramatic phrase for this. But at the same time, they're given a very good tactical education too but don't be an idiot about it. Use your firepower, bring up your light artillery, bring up your machine guns, dismount and make use of your troopers' firepower. And although we tend to think of the cavalry through the prism of the charge of the Light Brigade or the 17th Lancers motto, now the Royal Lancers motto, of death or glory, there's an element of that, but it's always meant to be tempered with very, very high levels of tactical training and astuteness. And it's interesting to me that Britain has no real new army cavalry. every cavalry unit that goes out on the Western Front is either regular or territorial. And probably the closest you get to New Army cavalry are the Australians, and even they come from a territorial tradition. And it means that cavalry officers are a pretty tough breed throughout the war, but especially in 1914, and that they are not moustache-twirling idiots that you sometimes see. I have to say, though, Dan, that there may be some truth in the cavalry image with some of the French and the German cavalry officers, because whereas we've talked at length now about the British changing cavalry and cavalry with you can fight dismounted and so on, the French and the Germans, they're not really there yet. And in some cases, both sides, both German and French cavalry, well, they'd be recognizable to Napoleon.
Yeah, which is incredible to think about, actually, when you look at this. And you could quite literally see it by Googling cavalry of 1914, and then perhaps looking for a painting of cavalry in 1814. In certain units, you certainly do see that. So French cuirassiers, for example, heavy cavalry go to war in 1914 still with breastplates. It's a throwback to a bygone era, but it doesn't do much against an 18-pounder or a 77mm German shrapnel shell that smashes into your chest. And certainly no protection there. Same with the Germans as well. In many cases, we'll go to war with very ornate plumed helmets that are great for deflecting a lance strike or a saber blow. Not so good against a high caliber rifled round, which of course is gonna do some serious damage, and of course certainly no element of camouflage involved. It really is quite incredible if you look at some of the early 1914, particularly just uniforms, and it does in a sense, I think, reinforce that stereotype that we have of cavalry in 1914 just being a transplant from the Napoleonic Wars. Doing the same thing, trying to advance against machine guns, waving a saber at them from 500 yards. Of course, that's ridiculous, and it doesn't really happen. It's very, very rare. It's worth pointing out as well, and just reinforcing what you said a minute ago, Spence. In many cases, these cavalrymen and cavalry officers, they are willing to do that. It's not to say that they don't want to, but they're certainly not lacking in guts. Good example being in 1914, young cavalryman who later on transfers to a new branch of service, a guy called Manfred von Richthofen, who's an Ulan at the outset of the war. By the time cavalry role changes again in 1915, he's going to move on to a new branch of service and, of course, become the most successful fighter pilot of the entire First World War. But let's not mistake here. He gets a lot of his dash and his courage and his spirit and the way that he fights from his experience in the cavalry. This isn't something an isolated incident. This is something that's been bred into him by guys in the German and French army, of course, the German in his case, who have still got this mindset of do or die. Now, it's going to be washed away very quickly when they're going to meet the realities, particularly of trench warfare in 1915. But even mass machine guns in a defensive position, of course, are going to have some serious outcomes for these guys. That being said, as we've hopefully established by now, cavalry does have its role, even if it goes ill-dressed, ill-prepared, looking very smart, perhaps at least superficially, naively into the war. It's not necessarily the case. Although we should mention, Spence, here, it's not a one-way street. Cavalry is certainly not in an ideal situation when it goes to war in 1914. It still has a couple of limitations, and some of these go back centuries as well. It really struggles in a couple of key areas. One, quite simply, horses are expensive to maintain. They're difficult to feed. They're difficult to keep alive. You don't have to keep you don't have to feed an armored car. You don't have to give it a warm bed at night. There are, of course, things that you do need to do to maintain it, but flesh is always going to be tougher to deal with. And as well, they're limited by the terrain they're on too, Spence.
They are. This is something I briefly mentioned at the head of the episode, that the terrain now in Western Europe is very different from a century earlier. You have industrialized cities, you have railways, you have canals in much larger numbers, you have slag heaps, mining towns, you have a much more built-up area, and you also have paved roads, which are pretty hard on men marching, and they're also hard on the horseshoes of cavalry maneuvering around. And you made a great point that cavalry has a big logistics trail. And it's going to need all kinds of things. It's going to need saddlery and leathers. It's going to need horseshoes, and it's going to need forage in enormous quantities. Now, you can feed your cavalry horse on whatever is available. They will crop grass and so on, but that's not what a war-fighting horse needs. It's going to start losing weight. It's going to start getting ill. And the harder you drive it, the weaker it's going to get until eventually it can go no further and it's going to let you down at the worst possible moment. This is what the British had learned to their cost in South Africa. But the French and the Germans have not yet learned this. And indeed, it's going to take them some time to learn this. And the other point about the amount of space this cavalry has to maneuver is also going to be a factor. When Napoleon invades Russia in 1812 with all that cavalry you mentioned previously, well, that's not so bad because you're invading a pre-industrial society with absolutely vast open spaces. When Germany invades Belgium and France, it does so with 10 cavalry divisions and somewhere close to 100,000 men, somewhere between 80 and 100,000 fighting men in the cavalry alone, making it probably the biggest ever cavalry force thrown into battle in history. By comparison, that's almost as many men as the BEF has in its entire army, now locked into cavalry. So probably around 90,000 fighting men in total, 10 divisions. But that's very difficult to actually maneuver. You're not going to draw up 10 cavalry divisions alongside one another. There just isn't the space. Cavalry occupy a huge amount of battlefield space. And in the condensed environment of Western Europe, opportunities for what the Germans have trained for in many respects, mass cavalry charges on a very large scale, brigade-level cavalry charges, possibly even divisional-level cavalry charges, aren't really possible. The terrain is just not suitable for this. And in the invasion into Belgium and France, the Germans allocate 5 cavalry divisions in 2 corps, 2 separate cavalry corps to face the British and the French Fifth Army. But significant that those problems you've outlined, Dan, the lack of space, the logistics trout, they almost immediately become apparent to the Germans. And the very first really big cavalry battle, it's interestingly enough, it's German cavalry against Belgian cavalry on the 12th of August 1914, at the Battle of Halen. It's also known as the Battle of the Silver Helmets because there's a large number of German cuirassiers here in their glorious silver armor, and a lot of them are killed or dismounted, and apparently the battlefield afterwards is littered with these discarded, really obsolete Napoleonic warfare helmets. And the Battle of the Silver Helmets is illustrative of a lot of problems that are going to bedevil the cavalry throughout the First World War, because what's happened very briefly is the Germans are trying to get around the flank of the Belgians near Liège. They seem to find an open gap, and German 4th Cavalry Division is trying to drive in through this gap. And they encounter Belgians in a defensive position in very built-up terrain. It's a mixture of Belgian cavalry and Belgian cyclists, actually, who've dismounted and are holding a position just beyond a river line and just beyond a bridge. And although the Belgians are outnumbered, they are in a good defensive position, and German 4th Cavalry basically tries to batter its way through head first with cavalry charges after cavalry charges. And it doesn't really work. The cavalry charges into these dense zones, these dense killing lanes. They're hit from the front and the flank. They're mown down. They eventually push the Belgians back through sheer weight of numbers. But in the process, German 4th Cavalry suffers about 16% casualties, and it loses over a quarter of all of its horses. About 501 men are killed, wounded, or missing, and about a quarter of its horses are gone. So this is a really heavy loss rate, and gives rise to quite a famous quote, famous certainly post-war in Germany, where a German survivor goes staggering back. Maximilian von Possek staggers back from this. He's been in a charge. He's a bit stunned, might be concussed. And somebody says to him, "Did you charge?" And he replies, "The brigade is destroyed. Rode in against infantry, artillery, and machine guns. Hung up on the wire, fell into a sunken road, all shot down." And that's largely the fate of the German charges during this battle, which I think really lays down a marker for what it's going to be like. Charging home in the style of Napoleon, well, it didn't work for Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, charging formed fixed infantry, and it's certainly not going to work in Belgium a century later, Dan.
Yeah, and that quote's great, actually, as I was hearing you say that. There's about 3 or 4 elements I think we can bring out in that one little group of about a dozen words, which I think really highlight the situation in 1914 as far as cavalry are concerned. And you're right, we have said at the start of this episode how cavalry actually can be very effective. They can be very effective in certain roles, and large mass bodies of cavalry is not one of them, to my mind, which is, of course, as you rightly say, what the French and the Germans have really banked on pre-war. Large bodies of cavalry advancing over open terrain, when you've got things like artillery that we've discussed that can fire, even in 1914, can fire significant distances, fire shrapnel shells, and do extremely high levels of damage against, let's face it, very big targets, there's really a recipe for disaster. It's something that we see, machine guns and artillery in a fixed position, a defensive formation. Really, cavalry is going to be extremely limited in its usefulness in that sense. What we really are looking at, I think, and I just take it, bearing in mind, of course, we're both British historians, and so there's going to be a lean in this direction. Actually, I'm going to argue that the British cavalry, in that sense, got things right in their employment of it in 1914. Much smaller groups, highly mobile, a lot of patrol work, a lot of scouting work, but also just maintaining things like cavalry screens, which by their nature are not big, compact groups. That's far more effective than attempting something that is almost out of the Napoleon or the Crimean War playbook. That really becomes clear very quickly that that's not going to work, even in a semi-mobile warfare scenario. I wonder if we just switch tack slightly here, Spence, to the first British engagement of the First World War, which actually is also a cavalry one. I wonder if you compare this alongside that German-Belgian engagement, and it maybe give a little of an idea about what we've been discussing here, about how this smaller, more mobile, slightly more dynamic role can be effective on the battlefield.
Absolutely. It makes for a really interesting comparison. So we did briefly discuss some of this on our Battle of Mons episode, but to reiterate, because that was a long time ago, that episode, on the 22nd of August, so the day before the Battle of Mons, the horsemen of the 4th Dragoon Guards, under their indefatigable leader, Major Tom Bridges, who's the hero of the podcast, they're north of Mons, and they are looking to ambush some Germans. They want to do this. This is part of the protective reconnaissance role and the reconnaissance role. They want to ambush some Germans and get some prisoners and get some information about what's lying in front of them. And they receive rumors actually from Belgian civilians. There's a patrol of what the British always refer to as Uhlans, which is lance-mounted German cavalry. One of the things the British often do is they refer to all German cavalry as Uhlans. In fact, there's varieties of German cavalry, but lance-armed cavalry are coming down the road and they're reconnoitering. And what's interesting is Bridges sets up his cavalrymen. He sets them up in an ambush position. So it's going to be a burst of dismounted fire, and then potentially he's going to chase them down. The very fact he can do that, he has the ability to deploy these trained men in a dismounted role, is significant. So they're lying in wait. German cavalry patrol comes down the road but gets spooked for some reason. Possibly a shot gives it away. Possibly they just notice that there's no Belgian civilians out, and it raises their hackles. They decide this isn't wise. So Bridges and his guys have to mount up and chase. And there's actually a pretty wild pursuit down the road before eventually the Dragoons catch up, and there's a brief and quite bloody, it has to be said, melee. And spare a thought, listeners, for a German Uhlan who lunges with his lance at a Dragoon Guardsman, only to find he's dueling the champion swordsman of the entire regiment, who parries away his lance thrust and then delivers a riposte to this poor chap's hand and chops off all of his fingers except his thumb with a single blow of his sword. A pretty agonizing and terrifying injury. And 4th Dragoon Guards rout the patrol, take some prisoners, fall back. It's the first shots fired in anger by the British Army on the Western Front in the First World War. It's a small action, and it's tempting to really read too much into it, but in a way, it's exactly what the British are trying to do with their cavalry. Small group, using dismounted firepower and the ability to fight on horseback as well. If they didn't have that ability, the Germans would have just retreated. They'd never have been caught, defeat the Germans in melee, and then fall back when more German forces are coming forward. And I think this sets a little bit of a tone about how to do it, how the cavalry are going to function. But of course, it's in the chaos and confusion that's going to follow as the full weight of German First Army smashes into the British Expeditionary Force at Mons. Fighting retreat begins. Well, suddenly, this cavalry we've been lauding really up until this point, it has to really get involved in the thick of it. It's going to be doing multiple roles at once. You have a big, broad cavalry screen, some of it protecting the tail of the BEF, other parts of it looking for the flanks of the Germans, trying to get a sense of the size of their advance, other parts of the cavalry formations moving around, moving between places, carrying messages and so on. A really swirling, flexible, chaotic, confusing, bloody period of fighting where the individual leadership of brigadiers, down to colonels, down to majors, down to captains, down to lieutenants, is absolutely essential. And they don't always get it right. And sometimes mistakes are made, even by the British cavalry we've been praising. And I'm thinking particularly, Dan, about what happens at Ordrenyi involving the 4th Dragoon Guards just 2 days after what had happened when they'd ambushed the Germans north of Mons.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think going back to your quote, there was a little bit of a giveaway on this one as well, because of course we heard from that one sentence quote a little while ago from the German cavalryman who said charged against machine guns, artillery, and then the revealing part of that sentence got hung up on the wire. I think is particularly interesting, and the reason being, of course, famously, and we've done a very geeky full-length episode about barbed wire in the Great War. What we didn't really cover in that is the fact that barbed wire exists before the Great War. It's not necessarily there to try and stop massive formations of infantry attacking a trench, but rather it's there to keep your cows in the field. Well, sad to say, it's still pretty effective keeping horses out of your field in 1914 as well. In fact, the story of the fight at Ordrenyi is a good example of actually how the terrain really impacts the battlefield. It's an opportunity and potentially a good one, actually. You know, we've got to sort of think back to this idea of this enormous branch of German First Army sweeping through and around the flank of the BEF, following, in fact, the day following the Battle of Mons and this withdrawal. There needs to be a stopping blow, particularly on the left flank of the British defensive line, to stop them being completely rolled up by this enormous weight of numbers that's coming in. And Major Tom Bridges and the 4th Dragoon Guards, they're going to make an attempt to deliver one of these stopping blows, and it's going to be done quite literally by cavalry charge, and it's across the fields of a little village called Ordrenyi, somewhere where both you and I, Spence, have been and guided before together. Actually, it's quite a remarkable battlefield to look at, because you know, to consider it in your mind's eye, you're talking a dead flat piece of open ground. Actually, when you walk there are sunken lanes, and there are areas where you can hide things like cavalry formations. And in fact, the British do manage to achieve some element of surprise when they charge into a fairly open flank of well-dispersed, not particularly cohesive German infantry at the time, and they managed to drive them to some extent backwards, reeling through themselves. It's really the forte of cavalry in a sense throughout history, not necessarily to break open any enemy formations, but to really deliver a chaotic charge into something that's already dispersed. That can be very effective. Now, the problem is, you know, you come across things that you don't expect. And without the opportunity to deliver a serious reconnaissance beforehand, you just can't know that 200 yards down the road, there's a string of barbed wire that's crossing a farmer's field that nobody's noticed yet. And what we find, and to great cost at Ordrenyi actually, is that running into agricultural barbed wire may as well be a 12-foot high hedge, because cavalry simply can't get across it. And if the cavalry can't reach you, things change, and they can change in a very deadly way, and in an instant too.
I think Ordrenyi is a great example of the perils of fighting with cavalry, even in relatively small groups. Desperate action. It's a flank guard action, as you mentioned. This big hook is coming around. It's the German right trying to get around the BEF's left on the 24th of August. A pretty desperate flank guard sent out, 2 infantry battalions, some light artillery, and some cavalry go out to try and screen this. There's no time to prepare a defensive position. The 9th Lancers and the 4th Dragoon Guards, at the height of this battle, with the Germans possibly bringing a division, or maybe even multiple divisions worth of troops against this flank guard, they're going to overwhelm it. It's inevitable. Just sheer weight of numbers is going to overwhelm it, unless something's done. And of course, the idea of flank and rear guards is it's about buying time, and for reasons that we'll never fully know, they've never fully been articulated, in the midst of a very confusing battle. It's very hot. There's a lot of dust coming up from the dry ground. Obviously, the air is rent with shrapnel and bullets. The cavalry, which have been fighting dismounted, decide there's an opportunity here. The Germans are coming across relatively open fields. We can get down a sunken lane, get on their flanks, burst out from that flank, and charge them. And if you've ever been to Ordrenyi, listeners, you'll know that sunken lane is a fantastic approach. It really is. It's very deep. You're under good cover. And the Lancers and the Dragoon Guards go this route, burst out to launch their charge, but they've mistimed it fractionally. Most of the German infantry hasn't yet emerged from its assault positions. A few Germans can't run away in time. They get mown down by the charging cavalry. The cavalry go on to try and hit the German gun line, run into this line of agricultural barbed wire instead. And they reel across the front of this barbed wire, taking fire all the way, go clattering off the battlefield to the flank. And actually, although in terms of casualties, it's not awful. There's about 100 casualties in total. Not as many as you might expect. Crucially, it disrupts the 9th Lancers and the 4th Dragoon Guards. They rocket away, they're removed from the battle, and eventually the infantry is overwhelmed in slightly tragic circumstances. And one thing I think about this, Dan, is you can look at this and go, well, a bit reckless, why do they do that? Simple answer is it's the fog of war. It's very confusing. But you made a good point. This actually comes pretty close to doing something very useful. If they had caught the Germans in the flank as they're crossing the field, it would have been a bloodbath for the Germans. And it would certainly have bought a lot of time for the flank guard, possibly to retreat back or to do something else. So it's fine margins in intense warfare like this. And though it ultimately ends in tragedy for the British and defeat in a local sense, or genuinely still achieves its goal, it holds off this flank attack. And listeners, if you think we're just overemphasizing the British a little bit in this, we are, full disclosure, British historians. It's worth mentioning that although the French cavalry don't have a fantastic 1914, they have a lot of difficulties, heavy losses, they're still wearing Napoleonic uniforms as well. Actually, French cavalry proves its worth alongside the British at Le Cateau on the 26th of August. And Le Cateau is quite interesting because one of the reasons that battle is fought during the retreat is because the British cavalry, for the one and only time on the retreat, British cavalry is dispersed, has been a bit scattered by the fighting of the previous days. Cavalry screen can't be guaranteed, which is why Smith Dorrien has to turn and fight. And listeners, if you're interested in that, we're going to detail it in the Mons episode. But there's a powerful addition at the Battle of Le Cateau, and that's actually a group of French cavalry who've had quite the adventure to actually get to where they end up.
Yeah, indeed. Now, I'm going to throw almost straight back to you, Spence, because I know you know this action much better than I do. But it's a wild corps of French cavalry who've kind of been careening around the battlefield. Nobody really knows what they've been doing for a couple of days, but they do find themselves extended out on the left flank of the BEF at Le Cateau, and actually are going to prove extremely useful in that position. They're going to offer some support at a key moment. And I think timing here is going to be everything, both on the left flank with the French, also on the right flank as well. And this is where I think we have going to find, I think for the first time, a real example of this kind of battle group mentality. Seeing an opportunity or seeing seeing a potential disaster unfold and reacting accordingly. And this is where we need to go back to this idea of, look, this cavalry is not just cavalry. It's not a bloke with a sword or a lance. It's somebody with a rifle who's fully trained as infantryman, who's got supporting machine gun and artillery firepower. This is a little all-arms group of its own, and actually they can be absolutely essential in plugging gaps in the battlefield as they appear, and they can get there a hell of a lot quicker than any other branch of service at the time. And this is exactly what we see, both on the left flank with the French and also on the right flank with the single brigade of the British cavalry as well, Spence.
Really true. And the Battle of Le Cateau, a desperate do-or-die rearguard, last stand almost from the British, crucial in allowing the British to break contact with the Germans. And it's often said the BF's flanks are up in the air at this battle, which to an extent they are. But are they really? And if you think about, as you mentioned, Sordet has the man in charge of the French is a guy called Sordet, and his cavalry division has had an incredible adventure, careening all over the battlefield, pushing it really to its limit, and it will exhaust itself by early September, but also showing the mobility of cavalry. The fact that Sordet can basically ride right across the front, going laterally to get into a position, and still fight at the end of it, says something about how mobile cavalry can be. And Sordet is able to position himself really on the far left of the BEF at the Battle of Le Cateau, provides really useful screening support, stops a major German offensive around there. And on the right, which is really the critical position at Le Cateau, the Germans overwhelm the right ultimately. They start lapping around through the village of Le Cateau itself. But they encounter and are encountered by the British 3rd Cavalry Brigade, which has become separated from the wider BEF under the command of Hubert Gough, a controversial British commander. He's basically appeared, he's trying to get back in touch with the army, it seems, and he's maneuvering around, and he suddenly sees a great mass of German troops are coming out of the village of Le Cateau, gets binoculars on them. Who are these guys? They're obviously German. Well, we're going to start shooting at them. And although he doesn't have a huge force, he has a cavalry brigade, which, listeners, to put it in context, in terms of the amount of firepower individually a cavalry brigade can generate, it's probably only equivalent to a battalion of infantry. But with machine guns and light artillery attached, suddenly that firepower increases. And Goff's 3rd Cavalry Brigade engages some of these German troops coming out of Le Cateau. There's no way he can stop them. He's vastly outnumbered. But what he does do is disrupt them, and he buys time. And he slows down that right flank attack for a crucial amount of time. May be decisive even in allowing the BEF to get away. That's disputed. Historians disagree about this, but it's a really crucial intervention. What's interesting is Goff is he's careening around the battlefield too. He's looking to make contact with somebody. He's made contact with the Germans. What does he do? He immediately attacks. And I think that shows a little bit of the cavalry spirit too. He's forced to withdraw, he's massively outgunned and outnumbered, but he does his job long enough and he falls back. He doesn't actually manage to make contact with the army. It's so confusing. He basically fights his own campaign. But the very fact that units can do this, can fight their own campaigns, I think says something about the independence, the determination of cavalry. That cavalry spirit is one of independent action and independent thought, and seizing opportunities when they arise. And Sordet and Goff is much maligned, of course, in British military history, seize opportunities, and they play a really important role. And I think they get neglected a little bit at Le Cateau because these actions are not taking place within sight of the main battle line. They're out on the flanks. But without them, without that cavalry being there, I think the entire British Second Corps would have been swallowed by the Germans and destroyed. So I think right there we've got a great argument for why the cavalry is retained. And there's other actions as well in the retreat that will follow, because the British break contact with the Germans at Le Cateau, continue the great retreat towards Paris. One of the reasons the Germans don't get back into contact with Second Corps is there's a lot of fierce fighting behind Second Corps between British and German cavalry. Constant small actions are going on and constant back and forths. And I'd just like to read a little quote out about this. This is a quote from an officer of the 20th Hussars who was involved in this. And he in a larger passage, he's referring to all these small actions, always sort of going on without anybody really being seen there. A burst of fire, an ambush here, a sudden counterattack there, a quick movement. Anything to delay the Germans. And a darling of the 20th Hussars wrote this. He said, "Success of the retreat is due in a very large measure to the excellence of the work done by small patrols. These small bodies of men, who were usually pushed boldly out a long way in advance of the main position, not only gave that early information of the enemy's movements on which the drill book insists, but also by their bold action caused the enemy delay and inconvenience out of all proportion to their numerical strength." And I think in this relatively brief period of mobile warfare, that's really the story of the British cavalry.
Absolutely. And in many senses, I think, these stories, the footnotes, and a number of which have quite simply disappeared from the history books and have never been written in the first place, are really the story of what cavalry achieves. It's this idea of, we talked about an offensive screen and going forwards and, meeting with the enemy. It's also, of course, preventing the enemy from catching up with you. And so these small actions, which are left with 1, 2, 3, or half a dozen guys killed, holding the corner of a field or a copse of trees, every one of them buys time. It's the same concept that we see again in 1940 with these rearguard actions to Dunkirk. But these are unsung heroes, I think, in a sense, particularly when we know what's coming in the 2, 3, and 4 years to follow, where we see enormous numbers. But actually, it's worth pointing out at Le Cateau, with these two corps of the BEF splitting around the Forêt de Montmau, it's the little fights for a clump of trees here or there, which quite simply saved the day. Had either Second or First Corps been really caught on the retreat, they would have been eaten up in two bite-sized chunks, and the BEF story in the Great War may have come to an end in 1914. But I don't think it's any understatement to say that it's the cavalry that is the hero of the hour. And I think it's a great opportunity, to I think give them a fair shake, because the Great War, in so many instances, what it's going to degenerate into in 1915, really, you look at that and say, well, how could cavalry operate? What's interesting, though, is that cavalry do continue to operate, and in the kind of Swiss Army knife metaphor of the Great War, they're going to continue to do good service, albeit not necessarily on horseback. Remember, the British cavalry in particular have been trained to infantry marksmanship standards. This makes them entirely flexible, makes them a high-speed, highly trained, well-provisioned force that can be delivered to key points on the battlefield at the right moment. And the First Battle of Ypres, Spence, is a great example of that.
It really is. And just before I get on to Ypres, Dan, I have to mention, for reasons of time, we won't go into great detail about them, but there's some pretty fierce cavalry actions on the retreat we haven't really got into detail on. There's an actual blood and thunder lance charge by the 12th Lancers at the action at Cerisy on the 28th of August. That's almost a model for how the British cavalry would like to conduct a fire and steel action, where they encounter a group of German cavalry who press in on them. The German cavalry get held up by dismounted gunfire and machine gun fire, which actually causes the German cavalry to lose their horses stampede. And then the 12th Lancers edge around a flank and then charge across a pretty open plateau right into the German flank. The Germans are dismounted, they can't retreat, they can't withdraw. They stand there and they basically have to try and fight it, and they're overwhelmed. They're completely destroyed by the 12th Lancers in a charge that would have made any cavalryman of the Napoleonic Wars proud. And an action, although it doesn't involve cavalry as in a mounted sense very much, but does involve cavalry artillery, is Neri on the 1st of September, where actually 1st Cavalry Brigade, British 1st Cavalry Brigade, is really taken by surprise, gets ambushed effectively by German cavalry who've taken some high ground to the east. There's a real period of utter chaos where 1st Cavalry is greatly dispersed, but the battle gets turned by a single gun from L Battery, the Royal Horse Artillery, who hold the line with just 3 crew members manning it for 2 hours and hold off the German assault long enough for the British to rally, turn around, and ultimately rout the Germans in return. And that famous gun is now the centerpiece, the opening exhibit of the Imperial War Museum. But we could go on for a long time about these type of actions. I wanted to mention them just to stop listeners who might be saying, well, what about those actions if you knew about them already? But your point, Dan, about First Ypres is really, really important, because the battle lines really run out of or start to become static in September at the end of the Battle of the Marne, where again British cavalry is very useful, advancing, reconnoitering, attacking the German and French German forces alongside the French, of course. And then there's this pause on the River Aisne. Basically, static warfare begins to set in, and the armies, particularly the British Army, begin to look north in the so-called race to the sea, looking for open flanks, looking to really, for the Allied perspective, drive towards Brussels, the Germans trying to drive towards Ypres and the Channel ports. And here the British cavalry is really useful, because by now the war's been going on for 6-7 weeks. High intensity, heavy casualties. And to be absolutely blunt, the French and the German cavalry are totally exhausted by mid-September, absolutely shattered. Their horses are exhausted, the men are exhausted, the horses aren't being cared for properly at all. And this is true of both German and French cavalry. And a British liaison officer, Lieutenant Edward Spears, very famous liaison officer, he's with the French, and he remembers that there were thousands of horses with sore backs because they'd been kept saddled too long, they'd been made to carry too much weight. And he added, the smell of some units, owing to this cause, was painful, because these poor horses were covered with infected sores all over their backs. And of course, they were going to be no use for mobility or for battle. And what it means is that the German and the French cavalry, they weren't completely out of action in September and October 1914, but their capacity for action was massively reduced. And in fact, the new German commander, Erich von Falkenhayn, taking over in September, he was so unimpressed with cavalry, his cavalry in that month, he actually ordered the dismounted cavalryman should be able to fight exactly as an infantryman. Cavalry charges no longer play any part in warfare. But making that change, it's one thing to pronounce it, it's another thing to actually make it reality. And although German cavalry does fight at First Ypres, it doesn't have much impact. In fact, the main role German cavalry has are being the last German troops who aren't prisoners to actually set foot in Ypres during the First World War. But he made a point, Dan, that the British cavalry, by contrast, has a very impressive, albeit a very hard fought First Deep. British cavalry can get up to the battlefront very quickly. And once the Allies come under huge pressure, once the German offensive really starts tearing into the Allied line, the cavalry, who are really behind the lines as the armies become locked together, the flanks are gone, continuous battlefront. But that mobility we've referred to, that ability to mount up and then take your machine guns, rifles, and your horse artillery and gallop to a crisis point becomes absolutely crucial. And the British use their cavalry formations as a mobile reserve that you can use to plug gaps at desperate moments. And these often are desperate moments because by now, casualties have mounted amongst the BEF. I mentioned before, a cavalry brigade has the firepower of about an infantry battalion, not least because 1 in 4 cavalrymen has to hold the horses, keep them detached. And these units have already taken casualties, so the numbers are quite small. But the arrival of a fast-moving, fresh group of highly trained soldiers carrying a good amount of firepower is pretty impressive. And at times, Dan, it really does turn the tide of battle.
Yeah, there's something of a watershed moment, I feel, when we talk about the first Battle of Ypres, because up until now, really, the bulk of the fighting, if you exclude what we've been discussing today, the bulk of the set-piece fighting, at least, is going to be conducted by the infantry, and British regular infantry at that. Now, by the time we get to October and November of 1914, that infantry is just as worn out as the French and German cavalry, utterly exhausted. They've been traveling everywhere by foot. They've been traveling everywhere as quickly as they can. They've, of course, been suffering casualties along the way as well. It's the arrival of units like the cavalry who are able to come up and plug gaps, of which there are plenty, at crucial times, of which there are many, is really important. And the first Battle of Ypres, particularly the fighting just south of the village of Gellevel in late October and early November, is going to be a great example of that. In fact, it's in terms of that watershed moment, Spence, it's one of those where actually we're going to see a change in the way that war is fought and who it's fought by. Because we're going to start to see in the north the emergence of trench warfare. We're going to start to see the possibility that mobility really is drawing to a halt. It's drawing to a halt, by the way, because of the defense of people like dismounted cavalrymen who are going to get into makeshift trenches. They're going to dig them by hand, some cases with their sabres, and they're going to be able to put up a fight which is eventually going to blunt this German advance. Interestingly, in this location, for the very first time, not only do you get cavalry in the line, but you get cavalry replaced in the line by territorials who are fresh out from the UK. So we're going to see this crossover, really, of the handing over of the fighting duties from the hard-pressed regular BEF to reserves coming out, territorials arriving, and the cavalry changing from the role in which it's hopefully we've established in this episode been absolutely vital at in the mobile aspects of 1914 to now becoming an element of the ground fighting as we understand it in trench warfare. And it's really a passing of the baton in some senses. Now, it's not to say, Spence, that men on horses are not going to play a key part in the fighting to come, but at least for the time being, from late 1914 onwards, that role is going to change.
It is. And at First Deep, where cavalry, really, they start to fight in a way that they're capable of, but it was not really the intention of them to fight this way. Using them in the trenches, using them to storm trenches. You actually get cavalry storming trenches, not on horseback, of course, but on foot. And they're actually British cavalry is pretty good at this. And then holding trenches, actually fighting dismounted with their horses some distance behind. Potentially you can fall back, but otherwise fighting in the trenches. And the cavalry does it without complaint, although it looks pretty strange to the French, it must be said. And British cavalry commander Edmund Allenby, going to be famous in the Middle East, he remembered after the war, during the war, I should say, at First Ypres, the French are much struck by the all-around work of our cavalry, but they are rather shocked to see them in the trenches, as they think that's derogatory to the cavalry's spirit, which of course we mentioned earlier in the episode. But in actual fact, I think it really fits the British cavalry's spirit, which is, we'll do it, what is it? And in this case, it's fighting from trenches, used as these mobile brigades, these emergency groups who can be put in at moments of crisis to just hold the line somewhere or capture a key position. And as I say, there are moments, the 16th Lancers in particular actually capture an entrenched German position using machine guns with their cavalry charging dismounted on foot, which is pretty remarkable. And indeed, the phrase actually gets used for some of these cavalry formations that they're fire brigades, because whenever there's an emergency, They get called up, they get called out. To quote Corporal of Horse Lloyd of the 7th Cavalry Brigade, he remembered, "Our brigade seemed to get a call almost every time, so we became known to the troops in the salient as Kavanagh's Fire Brigade. The shortage of casualties on those occasions was largely due to the masterly way in which we were handled by our brigadier. He never spared us. The brigade went, he took the lead, and there was no braver man in it than himself." And I've read that quote out particularly because Kavanagh, Blackjack Kavanagh, as he would be known, would go on to ultimately become the Cavalry Corps commander in the British Army after his stellar performance commanding this emergency cavalry formation at First Deep. And listeners, one thing to take away as we bring this episode to a conclusion is, by the end of 1914, all the armies are exhausted, the Western Front has formed, but very few people on the Western Front think that this is going to be permanent. They think the Western Front is a temporary problem. Eventually it's going to break apart and it's going to be dispersed. And there's going to be maneuver warfare, the like of which you've just seen. And if you think between August and November 1914, you have intense maneuver warfare, very heavy casualties, that's not an unreasonable prediction to make. And given the success of particularly British cavalry in 1914, as we've outlined, it's probably no surprise that the British Army is quite happy to have a high proportion of cavalry. And the Army went into war with 1 cavalry division in August 1914. It ends the war with 5 cavalry divisions, 2 of which are Indian cavalry, which is trained to a very similar standard to the British and perhaps even more aggressive, even more hard fighting than the British. And we can look at that and go, that's, with hindsight, that's a mistake. They're not going to have success on the Western Front in the way they think. But we know that because of hindsight. What we can say is that to the men of 1914, at the end of that year, British cavalry had very much fought with distinction. They've been a crucial element on the Great Retreat, and then they've been a crucial element in this desperate fighting at First Deep. And I think, Dan, if you were commander of the BF in 1914, and the government says to you, "Do you want more cavalry?" you give them a resounding yes.
Undoubtedly. It's almost unthinkable that the 1914 campaign is fought in the way that it's fought, and with the outcome that we get, had the cavalry not been present. And I think in a slightly tragic way, maybe the swan song of the cavalry, at least in that sense, in the way that it's operated in 1914, is not that it wins the Great War, it's the fact that it avoids, at least from a British perspective, the Great War being lost. Because had they not been there, quite simply, I think the BEF would have ceased to exist at some point during that Great Retreat. So the story of cavalry, absolutely fascinating. Of course, we've only really scratched the surface here, Spence. There's plenty more to come, and that changing role is going to be absolutely vital. But it doesn't see an end to things like cavalry charges, even during established trench warfare. It's also, of course, going to come into its own once again when we see a return to mobile warfare in 1918. But that is a story for next time. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. Even during established trench warfare. But that, of course, I said of course twice. But that, sorry.
Based on my limited knowledge of Napoleonic warfare, it sounded good to me.
I think we'll, I think we got it right. Okay. Cool.
Anybody complains, we're a First World War podcast, not a Napoleonic War podcast.
Exactly. Nice.